Hi, this is George Smart of U.S. Modernist Radio. The L.A. fires have devastated thousands of houses in the Los Angeles community, and our hearts go out to all of those that were affected. We'd like to know if you know of any architect-designed houses that were burned down. We are looking to document all of them in the U.S. Modernist Archives. Just send an email to george@usmodernist.org.
Hi, my name is Sue Ann Kahn. My latest book is Louis I. Kahn, The Last Notebook, published by Lars Muller. And you were listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Almost as inspiring as modernist houses are today's new mega transportation centers, those sweeping complexes for airports, urban rail, and subways that help move millions of people. They are huge canvases for architects like today's guest, Scottish architect John McAslan, who's working on the hot mess that is Penn Station in New York. Later, we'll explore the toast of Illinois, Champaign, with Phillip Kalantzis-Cope, author of Mid-Continent Modern, and Jeffrey Poss, who's one of the architects profiled in that very book. Then it's off to New York for a fine dining breakfast with returning podcast guest, singer Monika Ryan. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. One of the great pleasures of going to New York for me is breakfast. Back at home, having breakfast out means a McGriddle at McDonald's or a chicken biscuit at Bojangles. If company is in town, maybe we'll go to one of those hotel brunches that attempts to be way more sophisticated than it ever can be. And for pure gluttony, look no further than the Golden Corral Buffet, where if you do the math, the room is consuming about 1,200 pounds of food and 50 gallons of coffee per hour.
You know, that's a hometown business, George. They're headquartered right here in North Carolina.
But in the heart of Manhattan, and not in a diner, which has its own charms, better suited for 2 a.m, there are serene sanctuaries of breakfast elegance to be found. A fine dining restaurant where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingles with conversations in languages so foreign you can't even identify the country. The server, with practiced nonchalance, will refill the porcelain cup with a flourish of pouring for royalty. There are eggs Benedict, but with a top chef twist, like a chili-infused hollandaise or a smoked salmon puree. There are fluffy omelets filled with goat cheese and wild mushrooms, and escape from the harsh reality of the check that will appear later. There's a dazzling array of croissants, danishes, and muffins zooming around the room in baskets as they are passed out like Halloween candy to hungry toddlers. Of course, one can't do this all the time because breakfast for 2 will set you back $80. But there's really nothing to kick off a day like the true joy of a fine dining breakfast. The good news is you can skip lunch. And that, my friends, is being thrifty. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. John McAslan is a Scottish architect, philanthropist, and filmmaker. He graduated in 1978 from the University of Edinburgh, go Moose, and trained in Boston with Cambridge 7 and in London with Richard Rogers before starting John McAslan and Partners in 1993. Some of his famous projects include the King's Cross Station in London, Waterloo and Sydney Central Metro stations in Sydney, Australia, the Grand Central Station in Belfast, metro stations in Delhi, India, and the renovation of Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida, the largest collection of Wright buildings in the world, plus the long-awaited renovation of New York's Penn Station, one of the least pleasant public transportation hubs in the world. John and his wife, Dava, founded the John McAslan Family Trust in 1997 to provide support for the arts and educational programs, And if you head west out of Glasgow and catch the ferry at Gourock, you'll get to John's hometown, Dunoon, where he established a film series in 2012 at his elementary school. He has also produced 15 short films. Welcome, John.
Hello there, George.
It's so nice to talk with you.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
John, before we start talking about architecture, you joined a very exclusive club in 2012, the Commander of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth. Was that before or after the London Olympics?
My goodness. I think it was probably at the end of that year. So I think it was probably after the Olympics. And I wasn't participating in the Olympics, so it can have nothing to do with that, I think.
And where was this ceremony held?
Buckingham Palace.
And how was that for you? We don't really have any parallel experience in America, so I'm interested to hear.
Yeah, I think you do. I mean, in America, you've got, I suppose, the president's medals. That's sort of the equivalent, I guess, isn't it? You have it at the White House. So it's our version of that. You know, it's a honorary thing, and many people are awarded various awards from the Queen and now obviously the King since she passed away. And you know, people enjoy it. They take their families, and it's, you know, it's I guess it's a reward for some sort of contribution that you've made beyond the day-to-day.
Well, it's a very special international honor, and I understand a few perks go with it, like you get to use a special chapel at St. Paul's Cathedral. Is that right?
Well, I know that what can happen is that if you have a child, I think they can be married in the chapel. That didn't happen with our kids. They got married elsewhere, but I believe that that's possible. There are various things like that. I have to say I haven't looked them up. But listen, it was a nice thing to have, and the Queen was charming and interested in what we were doing. You know, you've got about 15 seconds or something with the Queen and now the King to say something. And I remember she actually referred to the fact that we had built a project at the Olympics. And she asked what other things we were doing. And I said, well, we're finishing the King's Cross station in London. There's a royal train leaves from King's Cross. And because the project took so long, I think occasionally the train couldn't leave from King's Cross. So she laughed and she said, oh, so you're responsible for the delays at King's Cross. And she had just put on this medal over my neck. And I said, and I sort of had to joke back. I said, well, would you like this back then, ma'am?
Well
and she
done.
laughed. I mean, I think she's got this to do to hundreds of people. She kept her spirits up. She was brilliant.
I always hear stories that she was quite more personable in person than she presented through television.
Oh, for sure. You know, she was very personable and had a good sense of humor, actually, as was evidenced by that. You know, the fact that she teased me about the fact that she couldn't get her train to leave King's Cross because we were late with our project was a good opener for me to make a comment back that was she found quite amusing, I think.
Oh, that's a good story.
There was nothing pompous, George, about the Queen. That was the thing. And her communication skills were really extraordinary. So I think she was a remarkable lady.
They really were. When she passed away, I went back and looked at some of the Queen's messages that she did every year. And what she was able to say was always quite uplifting, whether it had been a great year or whether it had been some kind of tragedy during that year.
Exactly. No, she was. She was, yeah, definitely.
Well, let's talk about Florida Southern College first. It's the largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in the world. And you were hired to come in and update a major building around 2000. This is after really decades of neglect on the campus. Wright's students, even though he died in 1959, are notoriously critical of other architects working on Wright's work. So how did you get through all that?
Well, George, I could spend probably the rest of the podcast talking about this, but I won't. I'll try to be brief. My wife's originally from Syracuse in New York, and her parents had an apartment in Naples, Florida. And every year we would visit them. And this year, which was the Christmas of, my goodness, whenever the year was, it goes back probably 25 years or so, or 30 years ago, we were driving from Philadelphia down to Naples. And I said a friend of mine, Thomas Fisher, who used to be editor of Progressive Architecture, is there anything interesting that I could visit in the northern bit of Florida because we were staying in Charleston, and then we were driving down to Naples. And we visit the Florida Southern College campus by Frank Lloyd Wright. And he said, well, have you heard of that? And I said, absolutely not. But I had visited a number of Wright buildings in Chicago, obviously Roby House and Fallingwater. So he was one of my heroes. So I said, absolutely, I'd love to go. And so on what was the 26th of December, or what we call Boxing Day, my wife and I and our 3 kids in the back of the car arrived at the Florida Southern campus. And of course, there's no one there. There's a guy, kind of a security guard, buzzing about in a golf buggy. And I wandered around and was fascinated because the buildings were, as you alluded to, were under some distress. I mean, they were falling apart. And you could literally pick off bits of the building and put it in your pocket. I mean, it was made of Wright's, what he called his textile block system, which was a concrete block that was made on site and then stacked one on top of another. So I was fascinated by this. I mean, the buildings were not perhaps what you might call vintage Wright, but they were interesting. They were the work of a master. And one or two of them, like the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel, was particularly beautiful. We were able to get into one or two of the buildings. So we walked around the campus, which was fascinating. We then drove on to Lakeland, Florida, and I called the head of development up at the campus a few days later and expressed an interest in finding out more. And he was generous enough to say that I could come and see him. So I drove up, I'll never forget, I think it was about the 29th of December, from Naples to Lakeland, met this guy, Bill Finch. We talked about the issues on the campus, and he was friendly but kind of clear to say, listen, we get thousands of people visiting the campus and offering up help, but nothing really ever happens. And I said, well, I can assure you that's not going to be my case. We are quite expert in repairing historic buildings. And I think importantly, I said, I think part of the problem you've got here is the kind of composition of the blockwork. And we know people, particularly engineers in London, who might be able to help. So he was grateful. Long story short, from that, we were able to raise some funds and get a very generous donation from a guy in England who owned a Frank Lloyd Wright house called Kentuck Knob, very close to Fallingwater.
Ah, Lord Palumbo.
Lord Palumbo, well done. And I'll never forget, George, because I went to see Lord Palumbo, and he really cut to the chase and said, so how much money would you like, John? And I said, oh, about 100,000. And he said, dollars or pounds? And I said dollars, and of course I should have said pounds, and he said fine, because that would have been more. And he made this incredible donation to the project. Now, it doesn't stop there, because we then still had to bid for the work. We had to compete, because that was the law. You had to compete for a partially state-funded project, but we were successful. And then we collaborated with a local practice and with Arup engineers for all of the repairs. And we were commissioned for the repair of the Polk County Science Building, which was the last building that Wright had built on the site, which was in really very, very bad condition and was almost uninhabitable. It took a number of years, and we were honored to be involved in a project that restored the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. It was quite a bold repair, and as I understand it, fairly successful.
Did you also do the visitor center there in one of those houses?
No, we didn't. The Polk County Science Building was the only one. And you know, George, the amazing thing was we got to understand the building so intimately, the way it was commissioned, the relationship between Wright and his client, who was a guy called Lud M. Spivey, who was the president of the college, and the extraordinary skill of Wright, but also his enormous ego and his need for money. He would write to Spivey, and they had a very close relationship, and would seek funds, and in return would be given a project. I mean, it's the largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright's work on a single site anywhere, so it's amazing. And, it's very late in Wright's career, so it's a marvelous story and sort of rich in the narrative of relationship between client and architect. You know, the students built the building, George. That's the other thing. the students got their tuition fees paid by effectively working on site and building the campus.
Oh, wow.
There's amazing photographs of students, these young, particularly, the young male students, I guess, working on the site, building the campus itself, and not building it particularly well, probably because they weren't trained. They were paid, I think it was 5 cents an hour or something. So it was an amazingly rich story and consumed me, I think, for probably 2-3 years. And then Lord Palumbo went to the opening of the building, but that was our only involvement. We also looked at repairing the esplanades, which were these connecting canopies.
Oh, yes. Really beautiful ways to walk around the campus and stay out of the rain.
Correct. Well, the ones that Wright designed were beautiful, but the ones that the college had built subsequently were not beautiful. They were very clunky, actually. The Wright ones are magnificent. What it made me realize as a kind of lesson in architecture was that a lot of what you might call the kind of maintenance of the buildings had been left only to local contractors, which didn't help secure their future. It needed a kind of forensic approach to understand how Wright had built, because he built using this very unusual textile stacked block. And the last thing I'd like to say about this is that when we analysed the engineering, the safety of the Polk building, it was made of this kind of crisscross, kind of almost like a tartan grid of reinforcement between the blocks. They said that if you were to knock down all of the blocks provide no support mechanism at all. It's the reinforcement holds the buildings up, which is rather scary to think.
Yes, indeed.
So there was no real structural diagram. It was a very hybrid structural arrangement. It was a magnificent just sort of episode in my life to be part of that project. And I had to convince the college that it was worth hiring a Brit rather than hiring a local, because I think they probably thought I'd go back to Britain, back to London, and forget about it. Well, this is before email or anything like that, really. And I was determined that I would be able to reply quickly to the client when I left Lakeland to get to Orlando and get a flight home. And I did it in a way that they would receive the minutes of a meeting basically before the end of the day. And they said, my God, you've got a quicker communication than Arab back to New York. So they sort of knew that the communication bit worked, so we were able to keep the process moving rather than delaying it. It was a marvelous, fantastic. They were a wonderful client. I enjoyed it hugely.
Well done, sir, on the communication strategy. Clients really love to get fast turnaround on things because it helps you help them.
Probably my greatest joy, but also my greatest frustration is good communication. Bad communications are incredibly frustrating. I mean, in life, and building a building or designing and building keeping a flow of information is vital. And that was a real lesson for me. And that something in my studio, they think I'm a pain in the neck, I think, because I go on and on and on about good communications, because it's the only way that teams, knowing what the left hand knows what the right hand's doing, pushing in the same direction, all of that stuff. I mean, it's like a football team or it's like anything.
Right.
Same principles.
Well, let's fast forward to a project that you're working on now. This is the reinvention of New York's Penn Station. I understand that the Moynihan part of the station is being complete. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard it's beautiful. What are you working on going forward?
If we just go back, George, a little bit, we were the architects for a big project in London called King's Cross Station. And that became our kind of calling card, I guess, for large, complex rail projects, which particularly need what we would call operational continuity, i.e. you can use them as the work progresses.
It's like LaGuardia got rebuilt recently while the airport was still running, which I thought was an amazing feat of engineering.
Exactly. LaGuardia is exactly the same. And so when it came to Penn Station, a master plan had been produced by a very good team of engineers and architects, WSP engineers and FXC architects in New York. And we were invited to join their bid for the main project. And we won that. And the project effectively is maintaining the operational continuity of the station, is to transform it, particularly to make it more pleasant for passengers. it's a dingy, dark, gloomy place.
It is. It's awful.
It's not good, but the reality is, if you've got 500,000 people, 600,000 people a day passing through any transit hub, it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine how you might be able to carry out a piece of work on a station like that to enhance it whilst retaining its in use. And so that's one of the great challenges. It then, of course, has to link up to Moynihan, which, as you say, is beautifully done by SOM and the team there. It's a fantastic project. And our project is for MTA, Amtrak, and New Jersey Transit. And I'm back in New York next week because we're getting close to developing a definitive design as part of the team. I think it's going to be great. It's wonderful to work in a city like New York, which is, it's a very different working environment from New York. One realizes the responsibility you have to make a success of this. Big transit projects like this are extraordinarily exciting. If you think of the people who are passing through Penn Station or LaGuardia or, JFK or Heathrow or whatever it is, these are hundreds of millions of people a year. And so your obligations to make things work well and to also provide daylight and a sense of an enhanced passenger journey experience is simple wayfinding, all of those things which are key. It's the architecture is important, but there are other issues here.
Well, a question I wanted to ask about the project going forward is Madison Square Garden going to stay around? Is it going away? How is it going to change?
Oh, no, it's staying.
It's staying.
It stays.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
So all of this work is underground, essentially.
It's beneath MSG and it's around the edges of MSG where it's possible to do a project. It's very complicated. And in fairness, I can't say very much about it because it's in progress, but it's taken a long, long time. And the team, I think the client has been incredibly supportive and the team has worked incredibly hard, the FXC and WSP team with us and others to bring this together. But I think we're getting there and we'll have something very exciting by certainly the end of the year to share.
Tell me about the time frame of these projects. So from the time that you pitch a client, say, to renovate Penn Station until the time it opens, how many years are we talking?
Oh, my goodness. Well, if you go right back to the beginning of WSP's involvement, then that's probably going to be 10 years, maybe longer, 12 years. I always take a project like King's Cross. King's Cross took 15 years from beginning to end. And in fact, we're still working on it, doing bits and pieces. These are long-term projects that require a huge amount of funding. You need political support. There are cycles of projects which come forward for consideration and then they stop. They require all sorts of adjoining conditions and disruptions. So they're long and they're complex. So you have to be prepared to go with the flow and just run with them.
You've done metro systems all over the world. What do you like to ride on the most? What's one of your favorite systems to be a passenger?
Well, that's interesting. Our latest project is in Sydney, in Australia, where we completed 2 stations for what's called the City Line for Sydney Metro. Now, Australia and Sydney in particular as a city has never really had a particular fondness for public transport. It's never been thought to be important or a priority because it's expensive and how do you pay for them? It's taxis. There's all sorts of issues involved and they're expensive to fund. So the Sydney Metro was a hugely important project for the city of Sydney. And we got commissioned for 2 stations on what is really the crucial line, which takes you from effectively the Sydney Opera House westward and then southward in the city. And we began that in 2018, and it actually was very fast. So it was completed in 6 years, effectively. And I was back in Sydney at the end of August to visit our 2 stations and, really more importantly, to ride the line fully and see how it operated. And that was magnificent because Sydney-siders, as they're called, were coming out in the hundreds of thousands of people to travel on the metro because it joins up bits of the city which had really never been joined up. And so the day I arrived from London after a long flight, the first thing I did was to quickly walk to the station. The first station we built, which was Central Station, as it's called, which is very, again, like King's Cross. It's old and new together. Enjoyed that. And then took the metro train right to the end of the line and came back and saw our Waterloo station, which we also built. And that I really enjoyed. And it's because, it was great to see stuff we'd built in use so quickly, but also to see how it made the city so much easier to move through and across. There had been an awful lot of grumbling in Sydney about the metro, disruption, cost, all of the stuff. But the moment it opened, I've seen nothing really but praise for it. And the fact that it's quickly transformed people's lives, daily lives, getting into work, getting out of work, getting to airports, doing other things. It's hugely beneficial, as indeed metro lines usually are. The other one we've worked on, which is called the Crossrail line or the Elizabeth line in London, does exactly the same thing. It links Heathrow Airport to the west, right back through the city and eastward. And it means public transport can take you from east-west right through the city. If you went on a taxi, that journey might cost you $300 or something. So if you get on the metro, it's about $10. So it's affordable. It makes places accessible. So I'm a great supporter of public transport, but particularly city transport. And although they're expensive to construct, metro stations, particularly those that need tunneling under cities, that's where the real big win is. Because light rail or tram systems are great, but they're often rather slow and disruptive. So metro stations, which are obviously more expensive, take much longer, ultimately is the best way to transform a city's infrastructure.
Well, John, I do hope, against all hope, that one day you will take on connecting the New York metro system to LaGuardia.
Oh, my goodness.
Because that is so dearly needed. They have this multi-billion-dollar set of terminals that they've constructed, and there's no easy way to get there.
Every time I come into New York or leave New York for Penn projects, I use a taxi because to me, it's the way to connect. And it's the uncertainty, I think, of taxi travel from the middle of New York, middle of Manhattan to, in our case, JFK, and the fact that it can take, an hour and a half at one point of the day. The same in Japan. If you're in Tokyo, in a taxi from Narita Airport to the center of the city, it's 2.5 hours. If you go from London across the city out to Heathrow, it can take you an hour and a half. It's a very uncivilized and uncertain way to move around a city. So public transport, connecting infrastructure, airports with downtown areas, with communities, is so important. And George, as I've said, the commitment of city government and of federal governments to commit to public transport is a big leap forward. Also, the uncertainty of cost. Those projects are so complicated, they invariably go above budget.
Oh, yes.
The metro in Sydney was about 25 billion Australian dollars, which actually is not that much when you think of what it's doing. The Elizabeth line in London was 20 billion pounds. It was more expensive. And metre length of tunnel and platform, much more expensive than the metro in Sydney. But eventually, when you look at the benefits to cities and to civilizing cities and to people movement and making people's journeys more pleasant, and high-speed rail is the other. In Britain, our government here cancelled the high-speed rail link, which would have provided a vital fast rail link north-south from London and would have brought economic prosperity to cities like Birmingham, which have been left out. There are cities that people think of Britain, they think of London. Well, that's the economic engine of the country, but it also means that cities like Birmingham and the conurbations around those cities, which have tens of millions of people, get left behind. Now, the government cancelled High Speed 2, as it's called, which I think is a very foolish thing to have done because the benefits to the north of Britain will be huge, and they just lost their nerve. They lost their nerve because of politically charged decisions. And of course, in the US, high-speed rail is something which is really very much in its infancy. I'm a big promoter of high-speed rail, which can connect regions and bring greater wealth and prosperity beyond capital cities. They do it fantastically well in Europe. We're in Italy just now. Italy is connected by an extraordinary high-speed rail link from Venice right through east and west through the country, and its benefits are enormous. So we've got a long way to go in Britain. I would suggest the same in the States to develop a more sophisticated and serious way of looking at public transport, enhancing public transport. If 60, 70% of the world's population are going to be urbanized in the future, then it's incredibly important that those urban areas are served quickly and effectively, efficiently with public transport systems which are ecologically more sound and which can make things work in a far easier and more appropriate way. So let's please all support the benefits that can be accrued and forthcoming through public transport.
Well, I know that there were a number of plans, getting back to LaGuardia, for reaching the airport, most of them through coming across different neighborhoods or elevated structures and things like that. I've always wondered, since they're going to close Rikers Island, the prison, which is right off the airport, you would think that somebody would come up with the idea of taking the N and W line and just going right off the beach over to Rikers Island and then connect over to LaGuardia. Do you know if that's been discussed at all?
I'm not involved in any of that, and that's news to me, George. But I think what you're saying is absolutely the case. You have to think out of the box with these transport initiatives. You have to think about other ways of connecting. So, for instance, elevated rail is often thought of as a kind of the least desirable way of connecting. But, for instance, in the high-speed rail link in Australia, down the Eastern Corridor, that will connect Brisbane through to Sydney, important economic and social corridor down the East Coast. It's where 70% of everybody in Australia lives, in that corridor, which takes in, obviously, Melbourne and the southwest. The idea of an elevated rail, which runs beside the highway on the East Coast, is a possible route. And people say, well, there's going to be ecological damage. There really isn't ecological damage. It's a pretty light way of building. It's a heck of a lot less intrusive than tunneled sections. It's fast, it's inexpensive. And so one has to look at different ways of making connectivity. And one of the projects I think you mentioned at the outset was Delhi Metro, as a project which we were involved in 2010. Prior to that, we were part of a consortium that won stations for Delhi Metro. And that project had been around for about 50 years, that the city of Delhi had talked about finding a way to create some sort of underground system, some sort of metro system to relieve the congestion and indeed reduce pollution at ground and above. And the Indians built a phenomenal metro system in about 5 years. It was a little late, but in relative terms, it wasn't. And it did transform the air quality, commuter lives and daily lives of people who came into and through the city of Delhi, which was hugely polluted at that point. Thankfully, it's now a much cleaner city to be in. So it's definitely the way forward. How you pay for it is always an issue. Do you pay for it through tax? Do you pay for it through private finance? There's all sorts of mechanisms. So they're complicated. They're complicated the long term, but the wins are great. If you can join them up, if you can join airport to city centre, you have to connect different modes of transport. Heavy rail to metro, metro to light rail to bus, bus to bicycle, right through to airport. So it's got to join up every mode of transport to make it effective. So it's difficult, but very exciting.
John, we are out of time. I could talk with you about this all day as a Metro fan.
You're very kind.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing the story about all these things. We're glad to have you back another time.
Thank you, George. Take care.
That was George with architect John McAslan. Phillip Kalantzis-Cope is the author of Mid-Continent Modern, the Champaign School of Mid-Century Architecture. This new book profiles the architects who brought modernism to the lovely university town of Champaign, Illinois. Its built environment features the work of architects like Jack Sherman Baker, John Gordon Replinger, A. Richard Williams, Robert Louis Amico, and Jeffrey Poss. Here's our conversation with author Phillip Kalantzis-Cope and one of those important architects, Jeffrey Poss.
The old expression is the toast of Illinois, Champaign. Been around for years. Guys, where did that expression come from? Did you run across that in putting this book together?
I have to say I've never heard that before.
What?
I've heard it's called a lot of different things. And I have a client who was a microbrewist, and he had the beer of Champagne as opposed to the champagne of beers.
Okay.
I have heard Champagne Urbana called other things like Chambana and shampoo banana, things like that. But
not things that the Chamber of Commerce would want you to be pointing out.
It depends. Maybe the Urbana Chamber of Commerce, but not the Champaign one.
Yeah, I always thought that the Chamber of Commerce or some convention and visitors bureau came up with that expression, the toast of Illinois, Champaign, as a great way to get people to come in to town and be tourists.
Well, that could very well be the case. And we're going to be working with them in the spring for a walking tour of some of these houses. So I'll be sure to ask them about that.
Phillip, what started your interest in putting this book together?
So this began with a conversation about 15 years ago. Jeff then was teaching in the architecture school. And in fact, he was an architect when my parents were a client for a meditation hut that was being built on their land. And so at the time I was finishing my PhD, I had different kind of photographic practice and work that was going on. And then Jeff started to tell the story about these three architects, Jack Baker, John Ripplinger, and Dick Williams. At the same time, the College of Education, which was one of Dick Williams' building, that was, in need of repair. And so we were, thinking about these architects. We were thinking about the kind of things that they had produced within our community. Also, the fact that all three of them taught at Illinois. So there's a kind of trifecta of a kind of built history that was important for us to document, a kind of tradition that came out of Illinois architecture, and also something that could be forward-facing to the community, of telling stories of the homeowners and the community that lived around these architects and homes. So we began this long 10-year process of going into people's homes and taking pictures and documenting, not really knowing where the project would take us. There were other architects, there were other buildings, there were other regions. So we just really zoomed in and focused in on this as a kind of baseline to begin this process. So it was a kind of happenstance that then turned into a really fruitful and ongoing project that we've now finally seen produced, come together in this book that was published this year.
How did modernism reach Urbana-Champaign? Was it an architect that moved to town or faculty that came? How did it get going in that area?
Well, I would say that it came after World War II. It wasn't really prevalent in the landscape here or in the school. But after World War II, there became a new generation of, in fact, all of them were veterans of World War II. And they were also interested in some of the new ideas coming out of the both coasts, but mostly the East Coast, and brought it into the studio. And also, these were teacher practitioners, and so they started bringing in this newer style. But it really wasn't from any outside sources, per se, other than there was a lot of influence of the Chicago area on the architects. At least one of them practiced for a time in office up there. But mostly it was just them being intrigued with the new ideas and generating their own philosophies and results of it.
Well, Palm Springs has the heat and the desert, and Sarasota has the water and the tropical environment. Are there any particular details to the Urbana-Champaign environment people had to prepare for in designing houses?
Well, I would say for one thing, you have greater extremes of climate. So there's a lot of things, a lot of details that you see in some of those places that aren't necessarily usable in this context. Champaign-Urbana is in a flat region that was developed from the glaciers that came up from, I think they're called the Wisconsinian glaciers. So it's basically left this very flat but very fertile soil. The eastern forests basically stopped just about at the Illinois border and became all tall grass prairie. And so we have this history of recognition of the horizon and the development of enclaves that resist the continuous open space. You see that on our campus too. Architects selected the Georgian style, which is a kind of ponderous, heavy architectural motif, and then they arranged it into courtyards and things. And I think all that was to begin to define a kind of urbanized space within the context of this open area. And that's why there's a lot of the projects in the book are developing around a courtyard, because it's a way of starting to contain the space within the domestic realm.
Now, these Georgian structures, were these the original architecture of the campus?
Yeah.
When was that?
Charles Platt and Stanley White were the two architects that developed the original master plan. I would say the style became really prominent in the early 20th century around here.
Yeah, 1910, 1920.
And so they developed a whole series of significant buildings that all captured that style.
Let's get back to modernism. So, Phillip, in the relationship between the things in your book and the campus, I have to assume that when faculty came to teach there, a lot of them wanted modernist houses, right? There was a connection there.
Yeah, look, there was a particular time when these houses were desirable objects. There is also a kind of history that we have where, and this is a kind of history that we are trying to draw out, where these homes were particularly were commissioned by faculty who also used it for other purposes, particularly in arts and design. And so these were houses, but also common spaces of creative practice, that there were where happenings happened, things happened. So there was this rich history of, when these architects taught here, they were building here, and there was a connection between faculty who desired these homes. It was not just faculty who desired these homes. There's the sense of the contemporary, which was always a big draw for what this moment was. And part of what we're trying to do now is make sure that that history is not lost, and that these buildings are taken care of and seen in a kind of heritage landscape. And that's been a big part of the agenda. And also this vernacular of, your question before, what makes it different? What were they doing within a context that visually was different, architecturally was different? What were the materials they used, and so on? So to position a kind of mid-continent modernism as a different kind of way of thinking, and that, these were some key figures that we may not have even known existed.
And to add to that, I think not only is it physical heritage, but it's a cultural heritage too, because in the 60s, there was a lot of interesting things happening with the arts and cultures in this area. There's a lot of experimental music. They had a festival of the arts that, if you look at the catalogs, it's jaw-dropping to see who was actually involved in these festivals. So it permeated several creative fields at the same time.
About how many modernist houses do you think are in town now?
Oh, it's a big question.
Well, I guess it also depends on how you define modernist. Does it mean that it doesn't have a sloped roof? Does it mean that it was built during a certain period? Does it mean that it uses a certain type of materials? Does it have a certain spatial concept going on? So it's really hard to say.
Take a stab at it, Jeffrey.
Yeah, give us a ballpark.
Okay, I'll take a stab. Well, how do you want me to define it? Is about the...
I don't want you to define it. I just want you to take an out-of-the-box stab. How many modernist houses in town?
Houses without turrets.
Okay, let's say 200.
All right.
Okay.
That's respectable.
Yeah.
There are a lot of them.
It's a dominant part of the landscape, of the urban form. But unfortunately, so many of them are kind of undesired, because of the kind of challenges of the environment. No one wants flat roofs now. It's, particularly when you get snow and, cold weather. And the upkeep of what these houses are is a pressing concern within this environment. So, while they're out there, we are trying to make a case for them to be restored, to, be something that is worth the investment in keeping in the physical landscape of our community.
Yeah, and Phillip mentioned in his introduction that we looked at a lot of different houses. And so one of the important criterias of including things in the book was that they are true to their original concept. We saw a lot of houses that were remodeled. And, some of them were remodeled in a thoughtful way, but it wasn't in keeping with the kind of archaeology of the original project would have involved.
Right. It's like attaching an Italianate villa onto the side of your modernist house.
Yeah, there's that. But I mean, even things that are more subtle, like just using the wrong materials in the kitchen. I mean, so many kitchens have been remodeled in a kind of awkward way from what the modernists originally envisioned. And, it's having the right person in the right place, or having the right client in the right place.
Sure.
With the ability to afford to make the necessary adjustments to whatever has been done or needs to be done.
Out of these 200 approximate houses, how many of them so far have the two of you visited?
So in the book, we kind of have about 20 or so projects in there. I think over the 10-year period, we've at least covered, 40 or 50 homes, but also not just in Champaign-Urbana. We followed these three architects to where they were building in central Illinois predominantly, and then we really honed it down to this community. So for us, this book, is the beginning of a broader project. We've got a website documentation parallel project where we want to put some of the homes that weren't included. There's been a cascading effect as well. Now people have seen it. It's out in the community that there's a whole lot of people lining up and putting up their hand and saying, hey, we are also part of this story. One of the big part about what we're trying to do is it's not just a book about architecture or architects or a genre. It's about all these things come together in a specific historical context and how it's embedded in people's lives and existences. So it tells a living story of what these homes are. And again, it's a kind of positional thing. It's your question at the start. Why do I care about mid-continent modernism? What is it? What is this thing? We just hope that we've put a little pin in the map and opened a conversation about what it means to be a vernacular within the US context.
I think that this is also an ongoing process. And so there's a lot of buildings, primarily houses, but also other types of buildings, some of which are in the book. We're continuing to see more. And I just recently saw a house by John Replinger. The client was a cartographer, and he spent his post-war years in Japan and got enamored with Japanese gardens. And so you had this house that was on a module and was surrounded by beautiful Japanese gardens. And I've been here for a long time, and I never knew it existed. And so you find projects like that, which are just exquisitely detailed and beautiful upkeep. And it's just astounding. It's just jaw-dropping. You think you know a place, and then you realize there's all these little enclaves of beauty and culture going on that you don't really even know about. And there's been a couple of experiences recently where I've been to houses that kind of follow those criteria, and they're really just beautifully executed. And the clients have done a beautiful job of curation, where they really sought out artifacts that complement the house, things like that. And I just think that's the greatest testament for a well-designed building you could possibly have.
Phillip, you mentioned earlier that there was a website that people could access to learn more about the houses in the area.
Yeah, so look, I gave you a sneak peek of what's to come. So this is something that we are still building.
Okay.
Our primary focus has been the book. There's an exhibition that we are working on that is starting in January.
Where is the exhibition going to be?
The exhibition is going to be at the Krannert Art Museum, which is on campus. And on May 31st is going to be a house tour of some of the projects that are in the book or in the exhibit, or both, actually, I guess. So we're looking at this as really starting to create a solid impact on all of the arts in the community and how they thrived in that time differently than they do now. A lot of these arts took place in private homes, and some of the homes that we're showing in the exhibit are very much a part of that. I'm putting together the exhibit right now, and we've got several images of dance performances in at least two of the spaces That was way before there was any cultural central location for dance performances. And so it was all done in these private spaces that became public spaces for a short term.
In these homes, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. How big a home do you need to put on a dance performance? A big one, I would think.
Well, bigger than the human body. There will be also an online aspect to this exhibit, too. And they're working on that. In addition to what Phillip is doing with Mid-Century Modern, there is going to be an online exhibit in connection with the gallery exhibit for this.
Okay. The book is Mid-Continent Modern, the Champaign School of Mid-Century Architecture. Gentlemen, thank you so much for talking with us.
Well, our pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
As a postscript to this interview, we found out where the phrase, the toast of Illinois, came from. It actually came from a song by Nashville recording artist Eddie Mogavero, and we'll have him on the show in a few weeks.
Returning podcast guest Monika Ryan is a graduate of the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music. Even as a teenager, she captivated audiences with her rich and expressive voice. After writing and producing her first album in 2000 at the age of 25, she has released 14 more records, including her latest, titled Alive. George and Monika recently had breakfast together at Balthazar in New York City.
Monika, thank you for joining me for breakfast this morning.
Thank you for inviting me. This is such a pleasure.
Where did you come in from today?
I came in from a town called Lawrence, which is between Princeton and Trenton.
Okay. And how far is that from the city about?
That's about an hour and 20 from Manhattan and about 45 from Philly.
Okay. Well, we are at Balthazar Restaurant, which is the place you may have heard of that James Corden had a little fit a year or so ago. It should be noted he did apologize
Well, that's
later
very important.
for all this action. And we're sitting outdoors. We're going to have some wonderful food delivered shortly. Monika, you have been in the jazz segment for a long time, since 2000, I think?
I've been recording since 2000, but I've been performing since the early 90s.
Okay. And this album coming up, is it 16?
It's 16, yes.
16, excellent, excellent. And it's going to be out in February.
Yes.
Tell me about the album.
The album is called Sweetness. Most of my albums are themed. I think about what I want to project out into the world, and then I write for that. And this is along the theme of playfully and alive. Sweetness is about all of the little opportunities for sweetness in life.
So like doing nice things for people or being kind, that kind of thing?
For sure. And for seeing somebody you haven't seen that you're delighted to see, like I'm delighted to see you. There's
Yeah.
a song called Hello. So the title track, Sweetness, talks about little sweet things like raindrops on your window pane and a postcard from a friend who's far away and all these little moments to savor life.
Yeah, I mean, postcards alone are sweet. You don't even see those much anymore.
I know, and they're so fun to receive, aren't they?
It really is. We have promotions every now and then where we'll ask people to go really old school and send us in postcards to enter in a contest.
That's
right?
fun.
You know, which is way back. And people still do it. We'll get postcards in the mail.
Yeah, it's a creative process. I mean, I remember picking out postcards to send to people, and you want to pick the one that they'll like, that has some sort of a meaning for you or for them or for both of you, or it's a process. It's a thoughtful process.
It used to be that you would go to tourist spots and there'd be racks of postcards with different scenes on them, and you don't really see those that much anymore.
They still have them in museums. You can get them in museums, and I use them as bookmarks occasionally.
Yes.
So.
And our food is just arriving here.
Oh, lovely. I think that's for you.
This looks like some scrambled eggs on toast, and that's a poached egg.
Thank you.
And there's some pepper being applied. There we go. Not for me, thank you.
That's beautiful.
It is beautiful. So I wish we could do the audio equivalent of Instagram, right? Where we could take a picture of the breakfast,
Yes.
right? And transmit it through the line. I'll try to describe mine, because Balthazar is a place that if you're in New York, you really want to come for breakfast or brunch. I have all these greens that are stacked on top of brightly yellow scrambled eggs, which are stacked on top of bright green avocado spread, not exactly guacamole, which is stacked on top of this brioche, I think, which is then stacked on top of some kind of oil and maybe pesto
Yeah, it looks
mixture.
Yeah, herbs. It's beautiful.
And what have you got over there? Tell our audience so they'll be hungry.
I have a Norwegian eggs, which is a poached egg with some lox on an English muffin and some beautiful hash browns. It's a gorgeous little bite.
Well, we're going to have breakfast now while Tom features a musical interlude. Monika, how was your breakfast?
Oh, it was delicious. The potatoes were extraordinary.
They had some kind of onion thing in them, didn't they?
Yes, it was like essence of onion, but there weren't a ton of onions mixed in with them. I don't know how they did that. They must have cooked it down in lots of onions.
Well, speaking of cooking things down, you have a way of cooking down tunes that is just incredible.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Tell me about your new album.
My new album, it's called Sweetness, and I have a wonderful band, some of whom I've known since I was a teenager, which is really fun because I've never recorded with them, but I've known them all these many years. I have Spike Wilner playing piano, and he is also, he's a wonderful piano player and always has been, but he's also the owner of the Mesro Jazz Club and Smalls Jazz Club.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he's fantastic. He's often supporting other people by putting on shows of all these wonderful artists from around the world, and I'm thrilled that he's playing on my project. I have Neil Miner on bass. I've also known him since I was probably about 18 or 19.
Okay.
Fantastic, high-in-demand bass player, very fun, calm, pleasant, friendly, excellent musician.
Yes.
And I have Joe Strasser on drums, and Joe was on my college audition for the New School when I was 16 years old. So he's a wonderful drummer, and of course we go all the way back to age 16. And the last person is the clarinet player, Adrian Galante, and Adrian is from Australia. And I met him at a Birdland cast party event where it's an open mic event and a lot of people from all over the place come and perform. And he was performing and I thought, he's wonderful. And I asked him if he arranges and he said yes. And so I sent over some of my music and he arranged it as well as played on the album.
So let's hear one of the songs from that album. What do you want to play first?
Let's play Everything is Possible.
You know how it goes. Sometimes the day seems unremarkable. That's how it is. You win some, you lose some. I was minding my biz, just getting through. Nothing seems sparkable. Then you rolled on in, and anything was possible. Was like a 180 turn on a dime. From nothing special to sparkle and shine. A jolt of joy that arrived right on time. Colors more vivid, melody sweeter. Now I'm carrying on like everything is simply wonderful. Just goes to show we never know what's coming our way. What a twist, you made my day something wildly magical. Now that you are here, everything is possible. Was like a 180 turn on a dime. From nothing special to sparkle and shine. A jolt of joy that arrived right on time. Colors more vivid, melodies sweeter. Now I'm carrying on like everything is simply wonderful. Just goes to show we never know what's coming our way. What a twist, you made my day something wildly magical. Now that you are here, everything is possible. It's possible. Now that you are here. Now that you are here. Everything is possible. Possible, possible. Now that you are here.
So I am all revved up now. That was great.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really fun. It was really fun to play.
What is the jazz scene like now in New York post-pandemic for you?
I think it's coming back. It has a lot to do with the venues. A lot of venues for jazz have their own draw and clientele. It's as much environmental as it is the musicians. And there are a lot of full clubs. We're a handful of them. It's really nice to go out. A lot of young people. Mesro and Smalls always attract really excellent crowds because they have excellent music all the time. And Django is a really fun place to go below the Roxy Hotel. And
Okay.
they often have full houses. They have live music upstairs and downstairs. So they usually have a good lobby band. And then they have headliners downstairs in a cave-like environment and very swanky, fun cocktails and mocktails. And,
Okay.
and there's Dizzy's uptown, and Dizzy's is beautiful. It's Lincoln Center opulence.
And Birdland is still around, right?
And Birdland is still around, and they do a lot of Broadway and a lot of jazz. They have an upstairs room and a downstairs room that's more like a closed theater, and there's all kinds of music there.
Does Michael Feinstein still have a club here?
54 Below is still here. I don't know if Michael Feinstein is still running it or
Okay.
not, but
Okay.
it's a wonderful room. I've seen a couple shows there last season. It's a beautiful space. Great food.
I can't remember where it was, but years ago, right before she passed away, I got to see Blossom Dearie perform here in New York, which is one of the
Wonderful.
most delightful experiences of my life.
Oh,
if
I'm
you've
sure.
never heard Blossom Dearie, you can Google for her on Spotify or Pandora. She had this great song about her attorney. It was called My Attorney Bernie, which doesn't sound like the topic for a great jazz tune, but it was one of her big hits.
I love Blossom Dearie.
Wasn't she great?
She was amazing. I never saw her live. I've been compared to her a bunch, which is an honor. Maybe people are hearing her influence.
Maybe so. Maybe you should add My Attorney Bernie to
Maybe
your
I should.
set, because if you're being compared, you might as well honor the lady.
Maybe I should. I'll go look it up.
Yeah. Well, let's hear a second song from the album. Which one is that?
How about Could It Be?
Could it be that you're in love with me? I can hardly believe it. Am I reading you right? I I've seen a spark in you ignite. It could be that there's a flame in me that mirrors the flame in you. Inside, I've a glow, it's true, an effervescence when I think of you. There's no hurry, no need to rush. Everything will unwind in its own time. I'm enjoying this moment now. I can see that you and I make harmony, two notes that sound sweetly together. What a stroke of luck in love. This could be a real and lasting love, a complementary and contrasting love. A steady yet still heady love. A come and get me when you're ready, love. 'Cause we could be.
Monika, you were telling me earlier over our eggs that your dad was a set designer for some movies.
He was a scenic artist. He didn't design them, but he built them.
He built them, okay.
Yes.
And he built a very famous fountain in a movie?
Yes, and the Money Pit. Yes, the fountain that Tom Hanks ends up in.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he worked on a lot of major movies and operas and TV shows. He was in the original crew for Saturday Night Live. He worked on the Godfather movies and A League of Their
Wow.
Own.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
he did sets for a Frank Sinatra concert somewhere in New York.
Right, because he played here a lot.
He tells one story of having to make a Julius Caesar, a giant 16-foot tall Julius Caesar for the Met. And he had to make it in a sound studio. And it had to be deconstructed to travel to the Met.
Yeah.
And he wasn't able to be there to have it reassembled. And they reassembled it with one of the arms backwards. And he had to say, excuse me, but we're going to have to deassemble it again and reassemble it. But think of this giant Julius Caesar with a hand on the hip and a finger in the air and it somehow being anatomically incorrect.
Incorrect?
Yeah.
And would you have to take the whole thing apart to fix one arm? Is that how it would work?
I would imagine that there's certainly a logic to how it comes apart and where the seams can be hidden, because it was probably plaster and wood to look like marble or stone. So I would imagine there would be seams in the arms maybe. So you could probably disassemble just the arms and switch them.
Well,
We'll see.
This has been delightful. Thank you so much for meeting me for breakfast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been delightful.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger. And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Palm Springs, Toronto, Los Angeles, and Malibu.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Fearless is her middle name, or could be Florence. We still don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Celebrity Breakfast edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
That'll be over easy for $80.